Hi, this is Philip Cotro with depthsofpentecost.com, teachings that bring you deeper into the Word of God. This is part 15 of our series on why the New Testament was written. And tonight we're going to be talking about Paul's second letter to Timothy. I've said before, one of the premises of this video series is that the books of the New Testament are not in the correct chronological order in most versions of the Bible. And so the whole point of this series, or at least part of the point, has been to put them in the correct order in which they were written. It really doesn't make sense in the New Testament as it's laid out, because you have 1 Timothy, then Titus, then 2 Timothy, then Titus. But Paul wrote 2 Timothy right before his death. So really, Paul writes 1 Timothy first, then Titus, then 2 Timothy. So that's what we'll be talking about tonight. Let's harken back to an earlier video where we talked about Paul's first imprisonment letters. In 61 through 63 AD, Paul was arrested for apparently stirring up riots. All he was doing was preaching. He appealed to Caesar, which he had right to do as a Roman citizen, and he spent the next 2 years in house arrest in Rome before being eventually dismissed due to lack of evidence. It was a cozy imprisonment. He was allowed visitors, and during this time he wrote 4 New Testament letters, which we talked about. It was Colossians, Philemon, Philippians, and Ephesians. But the world has changed since then, and it's changed very fast. Paul was released in 63 AD. Then we have the Great Fire of Rome, which we talked about. Then Nero blames the fire on the Christians. So in 65 AD, the Great Terror begins. The Nero persecutions begin. Rome has been stirred up against Christians due to this false accusation. The Nero persecutions last from 65 to 68 AD, and during that 3-year period, it's sort of like a great terror that breaks out, and it's really strong in Rome, but there is evidence of the persecution taking place outside of the Roman Empire. And understanding the New Testament books that were written during this time period really helps bring a lot of new context to those books. For example, Titus, 1 and 2 Timothy, and now tonight 2 Timothy. 2 Timothy is the third of what are called the pastoral letters. This is a term given in the 18th century to 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus. But it isn't really an accurate name because they weren't really written to any pastors. Timothy and Titus were church leaders for sure. And so they could be interpreted as pastoral letters because it does contain valuable leadership advice for Christians. So if you go back to our 1 Timothy class, you'll remember that Timothy was appointed as the leader over the church at Ephesus. Shortly after writing Titus, Paul tries to go to Ephesus to see Timothy personally with the intent of helping him straighten out the issues at Ephesus, the false doctrine that had really taken hold there. But Paul never made it. He was arrested and apprehended on his way there. So if you remember the video where we talked about John, why he wrote his gospel and his epistles, John had been sent in Paul's place because Paul never made it. And so John was in Ephesus at the time he wrote his gospel and his 3 letters. Paul's second arrest is very different from his first arrest. It isn't a house arrest. He's not really allowed any visitors. Paul is actually really a criminal at this time. So if you think back and you have to put yourself in the mindset of Rome at this time, Nero has blamed this great terrible fire on the Christians. So the Christians are public enemy number 1, and they're viewed with suspicion. They're kind of like how we today would view terrorists. And you got to figure Paul and Peter are really big prizes. Those are, the number 1 most wanted outlaws, sort of the way we today might have thought of Osama bin Laden. And so Paul's arrest is a big deal. So he is dragged in chains to one of Rome's most notorious prisons. It's called the Mamertine Dungeon. And he is thrown into the darkest, deepest bowels where he's far underground, far locked away from anyone, totally in seclusion. This is a place reserved for the worst of the worst criminals against Rome. And he's there for 2 years. Paul is hidden. He's hard to reach. A lot of Christians don't even really know where he is. In 67 AD, so about 2 years later, Paul's trial begins. And it's a disaster. He is charged with the crime merely of being a Christian. But unfortunately, while he's been able to really talk his way, if you go back over Acts, there are so many times that Paul was really put on the spot. He was put on trial, and he was able to sort of weasel his way out of it, with talking to King Agrippa, or pitting the Pharisees against the Sadducees until they argued amongst themselves and he was able to get away. But this time is different. This is the darkest time of Paul's ministry. No one is coming to his defense, that he has nothing but accusers. And many friends and allies who have been with him for years start to leave him. Among those are Phygelus, Hermogenes, and especially Demas, who is mentioned specifically in 2 Timothy. Paul writes of him, "Demas hath forsaken me, having loved this present world." So even many of the churches are starting to turn their back on Paul, and it's mostly due to fear of association. Again, I submit this as evidence that the Nero persecutions had spread to being outside of just Rome itself. So at this time, Paul is depressed, he is lonely, and he is abandoned. And he knows that his time is up. He's not going to be able to talk his way out of this like he has in many of his trials before. But just when all hope seems lost and things seem at the very end, Paul gets one final thing of encouragement. So the Lord almost blesses him with a good friend and a longtime ally who finds him somehow and is miraculously allowed to visit with him, and that is Luke. So Luke visits with Paul in prison. Paul knows he's going to die soon. He knows he doesn't have much longer left for this world. And for his final wish, he wants to make one request to Luke. He wants to write a second letter to Timothy because he has a great burden for the church at Ephesus. So 67 AD, Paul writes his second letter to Timothy, who was in charge of the church at Ephesus. 2 Timothy is the only letter that Paul wrote without provocation. In other words, he wasn't answering another letter or addressing a specific need in a church. 2 Timothy is one of the saddest books of the New Testament. It is a farewell letter, not just to Timothy at Ephesus, but to the Christian church and really to the world. It's a retrospective of Paul's life and ministry, especially in the concluding chapters 3 and 4, where he writes that I have fought the good fight, I have fought the fight of faith, and I am ready to go now to my reward. There's actually a lot of interesting references to the book of Ecclesiastes, and I could do that. That's sort of a different study, but I could actually take some scriptures in 2 Timothy and show that Paul was quoting or borrowing from Ecclesiastes, Solomon's final book written many, many years before. The main point of 2 Timothy is to give Timothy advice on how to care for the church after Paul is gone. How to deal with false doctrine, how to care for the faithful, and especially with dealing with people who have left. Because at this time in his life, Paul is very familiar with traitors, with people leaving and turning their backs on him. It contains a warning against Alexander the coppersmith and another mysterious man named Hymenaeus. These men were also mentioned in 1 Timothy. Alexander the coppersmith especially was a notorious man in the early church who had really opposed Paul in his ministry and was from Ephesus, and had really done some terrible things. It's not really mentioned what he did. These two men, Alexandra and Hymenaeus, are the only two people that Paul ever actually excommunicated. So around the same time that Paul is arrested, Peter was also arrested in Rome. And they were executed at about the same time, but not before Peter was able to write 2 Peter. So it's a little unclear which happened first, what the exact chain of events was. We have Paul writing 2 Timothy, Paul's execution, Peter's arrest, Peter writing 2 Peter, and then Peter's execution. They all sort of blur together, but happened at roughly the same time, in conjunction with one another. So next week, when we talk about 2 Peter, we'll go a little further into the deaths of Paul and Peter, and how their executions affected the Christian church at the time, as well as how the Nero persecutions finally came to an end. If you like this video, please subscribe. Feel free to hit the like button. Leave a comment. I'd love to hear what you guys thought of this. Feel free also to check out my weekly blog at depthsofpentecost.com. You can also follow me on Twitter at depthspentecost, and I'll leave links and all in the description below. Thanks for watching. God bless.